should have told their American friends about their secret guest, and that eventually happened, but it didn't happen right away. But in the meantime, they essentially got this amazing debrief with Carlos because they would sit down with him, get him super drunk, and just get him to talk about the shit that he did.
Been waiting on this book. It's time to get to it a little bit.
Okay.
So I had to keep my mouth shut on this, like I said, for about 2.5 years. You told me about this, like I'm working on this thing. And little did I know, you and I recorded, it was like that Friday in March 2024. It was like the 22nd or something like that. And I guess you got on a plane a day or two later.
Yep.
For Paris and went and visited Carlos the Jackal in prison. Is that correct?
That's right. So March 2025.
Okay. Who was Carlos the Jackal? Let's start there for people who don't know, because this is a very important story that, as you said, ties into very modern day issues right now. It's a symbolic time for it to come out.
So if we can roll back the clock a little bit. So most of us basically grew up in the 9/11 generation. So we think of terrorism, we think of Al-Qaeda and 9/11. There was a whole other generation, and I'm old enough that I remember it. But back in the 60s and 70s, there was this terror wave that involved hijackings of planes, hostage taking, murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games. It was an awful period, and any air travel involved the risk of hijacking or worse. And of that generation of terrorists, the one that became internationally famous was this guy who became known as Carlos the Jackal, who became the most famous of the Palestinian militants, even though he wasn't Palestinian at all. He was from Venezuela. He was some crazy kid who moved himself to the Middle East and thought he'd become a guerrilla freedom fighter, and ends up becoming a sleeper agent for the Palestinians, and then goes on to do one outrageous terrorist attack after another, and then eludes capture for 20 years. Essentially becomes famous in part because he was so good at getting away with it and just living like a rock star, living in fabulous hotels and meeting amazing women and drinking the best liquor, and just had this almost fable-like existence. And this is the guy that was really the international face of terrorism throughout the last century, the 70s and 80s through the 90s.
Laden, right?
Before Bin Laden. Yeah. Before Bin Laden basically changed how we think of terrorism. This was the guy. Bin Laden happened, we kind of forgot about him because he was by that time sitting in a prison in France and living not too badly if you're going to be in a prison. But
French prisons are nice.
French, they're not
Good
so bad.
cuisine.
The one that I saw before I visited him, it was actually originally a convent. And it was built in the Middle Ages, kind of convent turned prison. It is maybe not too big of a stretch, but he was captured in the 90s in a really dramatic fashion that we can talk about if you want. But he's not allowed to speak very much because he murdered a lot of French people. A lot of his terrorist attacks were in France, and the French don't like him getting the microphone. They don't like him being able to talk about his, glorify his past. Yeah. And so it took a very long time to get permission to get to talk to him. But once I did, it was just this moment that I'll never forget, kind of sitting in this prison, and in comes this man who was, when I was a kid, the most famous terrorist in the world. And now he's 75 years old and kind of an old man, but still kind of scary in his own way.
First of all, when did you first hatch the idea that you wanted to write a book on him, and how soon after that did you think in your head, damn, I wonder if I could talk to him?
So it's crazy how these ideas start sometimes. And for me, the Jackal was a name I remembered, almost like maybe kids who grew up in the 9/11 generation have this sense of Bin Laden being this boogeyman. And then there was an international search for him, and they found him and killed him and so on. So Carlos to me was kind of like that. I remembered some of the stories about him when I was young. And then when I was a reporter working as a terrorist in the Middle East, I kept running into his trail in weird ways. And, as you know, I spent a lot of time in Jordan, but I would talk to Jordanian intelligence guys, and they said, oh, yeah, Carlos the Jackal was here for a while. He kind of smuggled himself into our country. We didn't know he was here. And once we discovered it, we cultivated a relationship with him. We used to talk to one guy who his job was to bring liquor over to Carlos the Jackal in his little villa where he stayed in Amman and try to figure him out. So what is he doing here? What is he up to? Is he planning a terrorist attack? And they tried to befriend him.
Really?
Yeah.
Rather than arrest him?
Rather than arrest him. And that becomes kind of a contentious point in the book because the Jordanians should have told their American friends about their secret guest, and that eventually happened, but it didn't happen right away. But in the meantime, they essentially got this amazing debrief with Carlos because they would sit down with him, get him super drunk, and just get him to talk about the shit that he did. And so the guys that I would talk to, these are just regular sources, had the most amazing stories about Carlos the Jackal that I'd never heard before. I never knew anything about this part of his life.
Did they like him?
The thing is, you can't, that's a hard thing to say, like him, but he's a very charming guy.
Yes. And
the people that would describe to me their meetings with him after they overcame their initial fear. And this one guy's literally, there's this scene in the book where this Jordanian who meets Carlos for the first time, he's in an office and he's got his pistol out under the desk because he's so afraid this guy's going to come out and just gun him down. But after they figured out that he was pretty much harmless, he wasn't going to do anything to them, they were just fascinated to hear his stories and just kind of, because let's say he has the wildest stories in the world. He's lived the life of a rock star and being a slash terrorist and internationally wanted fugitive. And to get to spend time with him, it was fascinating for them.
Now, this is a guy, though, like you said, who was born in Venezuela. His father's a communist attorney in pre-communist Venezuela. It was not a communist country at the time. And he names his 3 kids after each part of, was it Lenin's name?
Lenin's name. So this founder of the Soviet Union's real name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. So he named his 3 sons Lenin, Vladimir, and then Ilich. And so he kind of had all parts of the name covered. And that just a testament to the father's devotion to communism. He literally considered Lenin the most important figure in all of human history. And so his kids' names were an homage to his communist hero.
And Carlos got the middle name, Ilich.
He got the middle name, even though he was the oldest kid, and kind of grew up with that legacy and was influenced by that, but also by kind of revolutionary fervor in Latin America at the time, because this was 60s, so time of, there's communist uprisings throughout Latin America. There are communist, militants in the jungle. This very famous character at the time named Che Guevara, who was like a swashbuckling, Latin American revolutionary, and you can see movies about him. You see his face on T-shirts. He was a very photogenic, good-looking guy, and he was Carlos's real hero. He wanted to be this, adventurer, revolutionary, larger-than-life character with beautiful women surrounding him. That was his goal in life, was to become that guy.
Young Carlos, though, who's looking up to Che Guevara, was it really because of the things Che Guevara emoted that you just laid out and the lifestyle he had? Or did he actually look into, say, the policies that he backed and the politics that he had and vibe with that?
So Carlos would always say the right things. Like, I'm for the common man. I'm a Marxist revolutionary. Reality was Carlos didn't really give a crap about any of that. Carlos wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be a Che Guevara. He wanted to have his picture on T-shirts. If he'd been living today, he'd have an Instagram account. He'd be all over TikTok. He'd be promoting himself and his own brand. Back then, you couldn't do that, but he just wanted to build an image and ended up getting a sexy nickname that he didn't plan on having. But once he was called Carlos the Jackal, then suddenly there's a whole, mystique that comes with that.
Oh yeah, and you can't get laid with that name. I can't help you.
Yeah, you can't. Well, if you can't get laid as Ilich, because that's just kind of a strange name. But if you're Carlos the Jackal, man, you could have films made about him, and you actually, of course, that went on to happen. The Bourne Identity series, that was initially a novel series by Robert Ludlum. He based his bad character was Carlos the Jackal. He created the entire persona of this the villain in all 3 of his novels based on Carlos. And
he had massive charisma.
Absolutely. And you could still see it, I must say, even as an old man. He kind of walks in a room and you can see there's a charm, but there's kind of a presence. And God knows I didn't admire him. And he said lots of things, in our meeting that reinforced the fact that he's essentially a criminal narcissist. He has that kind of brain. Doesn't regret any of the terrible things that he did. Feels like he's a hero in his own mind. but he is a charming bad guy, and that's, even the Jordanians who were trying to debrief him in the 90s, they could certainly see that that he's, as one guy who became a senior official in the Jordanian intelligence agency said, you can't help but like him. I just liked him, and was almost sorry to see him go.
So you're talking with your guys and they're whispering about this and telling you the stories in the 2010s while you're working on other things. And then you end up finishing Red Line, the book on Syria. And was it pretty much right after that where you're like, I got to go look at this again? Or?
There was another reason too. So I have, what you'll see in all my books is I have a kind of a writing style it's narrative nonfiction. And it's usually brilliant. Very character driven. Yeah. So the best book for me is one that tells a larger story, but so there's a central character that propels the narrative. And the story I wanted to tell is another origin story. Black Flag was a kind of an origin story of ISIS and where it came from. The Jackal story allows me to sort of explain how we got international terrorism, how that arose in the Middle East in the 60s and 70s, and who were the important characters and why it was able to flourish, and eventually why it failed, because these groups always overreach, their violence always turns people off, and they end up kind of becoming the reason for their own demise. But Carlos, luckily for me, is in all the right places at all the right times, and he allows me to kind of string together a bigger story about this important development in our modern history, with a singular figure in the middle of it who's you can't take your eyes off of him because he's just always doing something outrageous.
This is also a guy though that is still living when you're writing about him, and obviously we're going to talk about you going to talk with him and everything. But is there a difference in the approach for you from like a storytelling and writing perspective when you are dealing with someone who's still alive, especially when you may be having a conversation? That's
really appealing because there are parts of the Carlos story that had remained a mystery for a long time. And because people had kind of forgotten about him after 9/11, there was a lot of new material that had come out. Archival material from East Europe, for example, used to be kind of a pet. So the communist governments of Eastern Europe in the 90s and 80s kept him almost like their little dirty secret. Right. So we've got Carlos the Jackal living with us, and we could stop him if we wanted to, but we don't. We'd let him go out and bomb things in France and just live a crazy life in our own countries. And a lot of the files from that time only started coming out in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. Some of his former henchmen and closest associates are still around, so they can be debriefed. But Carlos himself obviously knows a lot. And I felt there was just finally a critical mass of material to kind of take a new look at the life of this guy who was once top of mind. People, he was a household name. And to reconstruct, how he came to be, how Carlos the Jackal came to exist in the light of all this new contextual material, it just seemed very attractive. And I just felt that people used to care a lot about Carlos, and if they reread his story in the context of how we got to where we are with terrorism and these other national threats, it'd be a story worth telling. And it was a lot of fun to report, I must say. It was just endlessly fascinating.
Thank you guys for watching the episode. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. They're both a huge, huge help. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram and X, those links are in my description below.